Charles Edward Anderson Berry was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1926. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood where music was everywhere, gospel in church, blues in bars, and jazz on the radio. Chuck loved it all. As a teenager, he picked up the guitar and began to teach himself. He admired Nat King Cole's smooth singing and Muddy Waters' raw blues power. He dreamed of mixing both styles together. But young Chuck wasn't just a dreamer. He had a natural stage presence. Even in high school talent shows, he stood out. His guitar playing had energy, his voice carried charm, and his smile lit up the room. Still, his teenage years were not easy. He got into trouble with the law and even spent time in reform school, yet music stayed in his heart. It was the one thing that gave him hope. Chuck believed he was born to play. He once said, "It started with the blues, and it ended with the blues, but I added my own flavor." No one knew yet, but this young man from St. Louis would soon create a new sound. That sound would change the world forever. After finishing school, Chuck worked ordinary jobs, factory work, janitor work, even as a hairdresser. But music always called him back. At night, he played in local clubs, mixing country songs with blues riffs. Audiences were surprised. Here was a black man playing country-style guitar with a blues rhythm. It felt fresh, different, exciting. Chuck's big break came when he visited Chicago. There, he met Muddy Waters, the blues legend himself. Waters introduced him to Leonard Chess of Chess Records. In 1955, Chuck auditioned. He played a reworked version of an old country tune, but with his own twist. Chess loved it. The song was recorded and released under the name Maybelline. The record exploded. Maybelline wasn't blues, it wasn't country, it was something brand new. The guitar riff jumped out like lightning. The lyrics told a teenage love story, and the beat was fast enough to make you dance. For the first time, teenagers felt like this music was their own. Chuck Berry had just given birth to rock and roll. The success of Maybelline put Chuck on the map, but this was only the beginning. He was about to start a run of hits that would define a generation. After Maybelline, Chuck Berry became unstoppable. He began writing songs that perfectly captured teenage life. Fast cars, first love, school problems, and dancing on Saturday nights. Chuck put it all into music. Songs like Roll Over Beethoven, Sweet Little 16, and Johnny Be Good were not just hits. They were blueprints for rock and roll. What made Chuck special was his ability to write stories in simple words. Teens could see themselves in his songs. At the same time, his guitar playing was electric. Those opening riffs became trademarks. You only had to hear a few notes and you knew it was Chuck Berry. He also had a stage move that made him unforgettable, the duck walk. Bending low, sliding across the stage while still playing guitar, Chuck made concerts wild and exciting. He gave rock and roll its first real showmanship. But behind the fame, Chuck worked hard. He carefully crafted his lyrics, making sure each line was sharp and clever. He studied the rhythm of speech, then turned it into music. For the first time, rock was about storytelling as much as sound. Chuck Berry was more than a musician. He was a poet of teenage life. In 1958, Chuck Berry released the song that would become his greatest legacy, Johnny Be Good. It was partly his own story. The lyrics told of a poor country boy who could play a guitar just like ringing a bell. That boy, of course, was Chuck himself. The song's guitar riff became one of the most famous in music history. Every kid who picked up a guitar wanted to learn it. Johnny Be Good was more than a hit. It became the anthem of rock and roll. Years later, when NASA sent a record into space to represent Earth's culture, they included this song. Think about that. Chuck Berry's music was chosen to represent humanity to the universe. The power of Johnny Be Good was that it spoke to anyone with a dream. It didn't matter if you were poor, unknown, or from nowhere, you could make it with talent and determination. That was Chuck Berry's message. It was a song of hope, ambition, and rebellion. No other song better captured the spirit of rock. Even today, decades later, the opening riff of Johnny Be Good can still electrify a room. It remains the heart of Chuck Berry's legacy. With fame came challenges. Chuck Berry toured constantly, but life on the road wasn't always easy. America in the 1950s was still deeply divided by race. As a black artist, Chuck faced discrimination. Some hotels refused him. Some venues paid him less than white musicians. Yet despite the prejudice, Chuck kept pushing forward. But trouble also came from his own choices. In 1959, he was arrested under the Mann Act, accused of transporting a minor across state lines. Though the case was controversial and many believed racism played a role, Chuck was sentenced to prison. His career came to a sudden stop. For nearly 2 years, he sat behind bars watching as younger acts began to rise. Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard were becoming household names. Chuck worried his time might be over. Yet when he was released, he refused to give up. He came back strong, releasing new hits like Nadine and No Particular Place to Go. The world had changed, but Chuck Berry was still Chuck Berry. His guitar still rang loud, his lyrics still told stories, and his spirit refused to fade. Rock and roll was built on rebellion, and Chuck lived it. By the 1960s, a new wave of bands was taking over. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and countless others were reshaping rock, but at the center of their inspiration was Chuck Berry. The Beatles covered roll-over Beethoven and rock and roll music in their early days. John Lennon once admitted, if you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry. The Rolling Stones also worshipped Chuck. Their early hit, Come On, was actually a Chuck Berry song. Keith Richards studied Chuck's riffs like a textbook. That classic Chuck Berry guitar style became the foundation for the Stones' sound. Chuck wasn't just an influence, he was the blueprint. What made it even more powerful was that Chuck had crossed the color line in music. White and black musicians alike borrowed from his sound. He united audiences who in other parts of life stayed divided. In this way, Chuck Berry didn't just invent rock, he made it universal. Even as the British invasion took the spotlight, Chuck's fingerprints were on every record. Without him, there would be no Beatles, no Stones, no modern rock. He was the father, and they were his children. Chuck Berry had an unusual career compared to many stars. While most big acts built bands, hired managers, and worked with record labels, Chuck preferred to work alone. On tour, he often showed up in a new city without a band. Instead, local musicians were hired to back him up. He expected them to know his songs by heart. Sometimes this worked perfectly. Other times it led to chaos. But that was Chuck Berry. He played by his own rules. He also had a reputation for being tough in business. He demanded payment in cash before he performed. Promoters often complained, but Chuck never changed his ways. He didn't trust the music industry, and maybe for good reason. Many black artists had been cheated out of royalties, but Chuck made sure he got what he deserved. Still, this lone wolf style made him difficult to work with. Some saw him as stubborn, others as smart. Either way, it gave him control over his career. Chuck Berry was not a man who wanted to be managed. He was the boss, the star, and the businessman. This independence became part of his legend. He wasn't just rock's father, he was also its outlaw. By the 1970s, rock music had exploded into many styles: hard rock, punk, disco. But Chuck Berry remained a legend. In 1972, he had an unexpected comeback with a novelty hit called My Ding-a-Ling. The song was playful, even silly, but it went to #1 on the charts. Chuck laughed at the irony. After creating the blueprint for rock and roll, his biggest hit was a joke song. Still, it proved his staying power. He continued touring worldwide. Crowds came not just for the music, but to see the man who started it all. In 1979, Chuck performed at the White House for President Jimmy Carter. Imagine that, a kid from St. Louis who once got in trouble with the law now playing for the president. It showed just how far he had come. Chuck also became the subject of tributes. Youngiti, Eris worshipped him. Old fans celebrated him, and historians began calling him the father of rock and roll. By then, Chuck Berry didn't need new hits. His legacy was secure. Every time a band plugged in a guitar and played a riff, his spirit was alive. He had become larger than life. In 1986, Chuck Berry was one of the very first musicians inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The hall described him as giving rock its style and its substance. He wasn't just an influence, he was the foundation. Over the years, Chuck collected many awards, including a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. He even received the Kennedy Center honors for his cultural impact. But perhaps his greatest honor was the way his songs lived on. Generations of musicians, from Bruce Springsteen to AC/DC, borrowed from Chuck's riffs. His music became the language of rock, and his image, the duck walk, the guitar, the sly smile, became eternal. Yet Chuck himself was a complicated figure. He could be charming one moment, stubborn the next. He lived life on his own terms, for better or worse. But no one could deny his importance. He turned teenage dreams into music. He made the guitar the king of instruments. He broke down racial barriers in popular culture. Without Chuck Berry, music would sound very different today. His name was etched forever in history. Chuck Berry lived to be 90 years old. Even in his later years, he continued to perform at his own club, Blueberry Hill, in St. Louis. Fans traveled from around the world just to see him play. In March 2017, Chuck Berry passed away. The world mourned, but it also celebrated. His songs were still blasting on radios, still being played by new guitarists learning their first riffs. Chuck once said, "Everything I wrote about was about people's experiences. If you have lived it, then you can feel it." That was his gift. He turned everyday life into eternal songs. His legacy wasn't just music, it was freedom, rebellion, and joy. When we hear Johnny Be Good, we still feel that same excitement teenagers felt in the 1950s. Rock and roll never grows old because Chuck Berry made it timeless. The story of Chuck Berry is the story of rock itself, born in the blues, raised on country, and given wings by electric guitar. He was the pioneer, the storyteller, the rebel. And though he is gone, his sound will never die. Chuck Berry is forever the father of rock and roll,